Okay, we'll get started in about 20 seconds here. I just want to give everyone a second or two to kind of trickle in on Zoom or on Zoom and on YouTube as well. So. All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning or evening or afternoon, wherever you happen to be. I'm John S. Van Oudenaarden, Editor-in-Chief of China Brief and China Program Manager here at the Jamestown Foundation in Washington, D.C. And today we're going to discuss Saturday's local elections in Taiwan. I think the elections would have been the big news of the weekend. But of course, on Sunday, we had some remarkable developments on the other side of the straits in China, where we saw mass protests, ostensibly in response to the November 24th Xinjiang fire in Urumqi, but also kind of seen as a broader pushback against the zero COVID policies. Nevertheless, I think the juxtaposition could not be starker between the largely free, fair, and orderly elections that were held in Taiwan, in which the ruling party suffered a significant electoral setback, and the images of security forces facing down peaceful protesters on the streets of Shanghai, Beijing, and Chengdu, holding up sheets of blank white paper. While Taiwan sustained and cemented its democratic tradition, the PRC showed its whole process people's democracy to be anything but over the past few days. So with that very broad context, let's turn our focus now to the 9-1 local elections, which, as I mentioned, resulted in significant gains for the opposition KMT and setbacks for the DPP party. And in fact, the defeat was so consequential or so severe that President Tsai resigned as chair of the DPP. But nevertheless, kind of based on past precedent, we know that the contours of the presidential election will be kind of fought along different lines. So we've got three fantastic speakers here with us today, and I'll just introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. So first we have Horace Templeman, who is the Research Fellow at Hoover Institution and a manager of the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region there, and also a lecturer at the Center for East Asian Studies at Stanford University. We have Christina Lai. And just want to thank Garris for joining us so early in the morning in California. Then we have Christina Lai, who's joining us actually from Taiwan. She's a junior research fellow at Academia Sinica, and also a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, the Global Security Studies program. And finally, last but not least, we have Russell Shao, who's the executive director of the Global Taiwan Institute and a senior fellow here with us at the Jamestown Foundation in Washington, D.C. So with that, Garris, why don't we turn over to you to kind of give us an overview of the election before we dive into some more specific issues, the economic issues with Christina, and then kind of the broader national and international context with Russell. Thank you.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, John, for having me. Good morning, everyone. And I didn't realize Christina was actually in Taiwan right now, so it's very late there. One of the wonders of the Zoom world is we can actually do this live. So I do have some slides here. I'm going to see if I can share these with everyone. Let's see. Can you all see these slides? Yes. Okay, great. So I wanted to just describe a little bit for our audience what these elections entailed in Taiwan. So on Saturday, voters went to the polls from 8 to 4, and they had a bunch of different races they were voting on. Taiwan actually has 9 different types of elections that are now all combined in a single election day. So every office except the president and the legislature is elected on the same day. And these are sometimes called midterm elections simply because they're the one kind of omnibus election that happens in between presidential election cycles. The races that get the most attention are the mayors and county or city executives. Let me just say, these are often called the 9-in-1 elections because they involve 9 different types of offices. The ones, again, that get the most attention are the mayors of the special municipalities, of which there are 6 in Taiwan now. Just below those are the city councilors. And then in the special municipalities, there's also indigenous districts, which under Taiwan local government law are supposed to have elected indigenous heads. So those for indigenous voters are a separate electoral ballot as well. And then those indigenous districts also have indigenous representatives in them. So those two are, I won't talk about the results of those anymore today, but just keep in mind that there is a separate electoral tier for indigenous voters in these elections as well. At the county and city level, we also have executives and city councilors. And then below that level, there are township or town or city heads and councilors as well. And then the lowest level in the Taiwanese local government system is the ward or village chief, the Cun or Lijiang. What's interesting about these elections in this case is they used to all be held at very different times. So they were non-concurrent. And what that meant is you had a different kind of electorate coming out for different elections. In particular for the lowest level, the ward and village chiefs, these were often held a kind of off years or off cycle, and they had very low turnout. And so the ward and village chiefs tended to be representatives of local factions. They tend to be the lowest node in the kind of factional structure in Taiwan's political system. These all got combined over the last decade. So we used to have the city and council and county level elections in 2005, 2009, and then the special municipalities were 2006 and 10. In 2014, they combined all of these into one giant election and all the other races as well. And so the effect of this actually is to push it towards a more kind of national swing. So in 2014, we actually saw a very unpopular KMT president, Ma Ying-jeou, at that time was polling well under 20%. The local elections turned into kind of a referendum on his tenure in office, and the DPP cleaned up. They actually did quite well relative to past performance in these local elections in 2014. And so most observers of Taiwan politics would call this a wave election, where the candidates mattered less and the party mattered more. Particularly at the top levels, but even a couple levels down, the DPP really increased their seat share, increased their vote share, and the KMT really suffered in these elections. In 2018, we had the opposite. It was another wave election, but this time it was a blue wave rather than a green wave. And so in 2018, Tsai Ing-wen was fairly unpopular as well. There's a lot of frustration within the DPP base, actually, with her government at this time. And so the KMT shocked a lot of people by winning not only the majority of races, but in a couple places where the DPP, it was like the DPP heartland. So the most shocking outcome was in Kaohsiung City, which is a pretty green city controlled by the DPP for 20 years. There, we had an upstart candidate, Han Guoyu, who kind of ran a populist-style campaign and won over 50% of the vote there. And across the island, then we had the KMT making inroads in places where They had not traditionally done well, and also um, bringing in a surge of new mayors and city councilors as well. So then going into the 2022 cycle, part of the question was, well, would we have another green wave? Would we have a repeat of the blue wave or something in between? And in one sense, this looks like a repeat of 2018. The KMT has won big again in these elections. It won a majority of the local mayor's races. The DPP performed at about the bottom of the potential range of outcomes here. They managed to win only 5 of the local mayor's seats. They lost a couple high-profile races in Taipei City and in Taoyuan. They had controlled the seats in Hsinchu and in Keelung. The mayor there was a DPP mayor. Both of those have now flipped to other parties. And so in one sense, this is another big win for the KMT and kind of a rejection of DPP governance at the local level. But there's also kind of a curious puzzle here that I'll get to in a moment, which is that Tsai Ing-wen herself is actually not very unpopular. So Tsai Ing-wen herself is polling pretty well. She's above 50% approval rating. The DPP has a lot more partisans in the electorate. And the KMT has not been particularly popular in public opinion ratings. And so we've got a little bit of a puzzle here. This, to my mind, looks a lot different from the kind of fundamental conditions of 2018, where this was a national wave kind of rejecting the incumbent at the central government level. Here, I don't think we see that kind of fundamental shift in politics as much. And so I'll dig into this in a little bit, and I hope we can have a robust discussion about this. But in the interest of time, let me just jump ahead to some of the marquee races. So I've said the KMT won big in this election. The most prominent winner here is in Taipei City. Taipei is the capital. There was a very high-profile 3-cornered race in Taipei that featured a KMT candidate, Jiang Wan'an, who's an incumbent legislator. He also is the ostensible great-grandson of Chiang Kai-shek. And so in that sense, his father actually was a longtime KMT party official, very high in the party. And in that sense, he's KMT royalty. He's also unusual in the KMT in that he's fairly young. He's in his early 40s. He studied abroad. He speaks decent English. And so he is kind of a new face in the party and was portrayed in the media, at least, as a rising star within the KMT. He faced off against Chen Shizhong, who was the head of the Health and Welfare Ministry, and then led the Tsai administration's response to COVID. Chen Shizhong was quite prominent and quite popular during the early period of the COVID pandemic. But he has never run for political office before. This was his first election campaign. And ultimately, he came in, I think, towards the bottom of the plausible range of outcomes in this election as well. In third place in this 3-cornered race is Huang Shanshan, the deputy mayor of Taipei, who's an ally of the current mayor Ko Wen-je. And she came in, there was some speculation that she might actually win this race, but she came in a pretty distant third in the end. And so the KMT candidate here really, I think, outperformed expectations in this election. The other really high-profile race was in Taoyuan. This is one of the 6 special municipalities. The DPP had controlled this municipality for the last 8 years, but the incumbent there was term limited out, had to step down. And in this race, the KMT nominated Zhang Shanzhen, who is the former vice presidential candidate in 2020. He also was briefly premier during the end of the Ma Ying-jeou era. He faced off initially against the former Hsinchu mayor, Lin Zhengjie, who had to withdraw because of a scandal involving plagiarism. And so this plagiarism scandal then kind of rippled out through Taiwan politics over the next few months. And several other candidates were in both parties. In fact, all political camps had candidates accused of plagiarizing their master's theses and otherwise engaging in some kind of dishonest academic behavior. So the DPP had to find a substitute candidate here very late. They chose the legislator Zheng Yunpeng, who then had to face off against a renegade candidate from the DPP camp who stole some of his vote. In the end, Zheng Yunpeng actually, I think, performed close to the bottom of potential outcomes here, and Zhang Shanzheng won a pretty easy victory, surprisingly easy, in my view, in Taoyuan. And so we've got another major municipality that has now swung back to the KMT camp. The other really high-profile race was in Hsinchu City. Hsinchu City is where Taiwan's semiconductor industry, it's where the bulk of it is located. It's got a relatively well-educated population. There's a lot of people who've moved in over the last decade. And so the politics here really kind of favored a smart centrist independent candidate. And here the Taiwan People's Party of Ko Wen-je nominated the legislator Gao Hong'an. And we ended up with a very hotly contested three-way race, much like Taipei, between the centrist TPP candidate, the DPP candidate, and KMT KMT council member from Hsinchu as well. And in the end, Gao Hong'an won a pretty surprising victory here as well. I had always thought she would be the underdog in this race, but she has a PhD in engineering from the U.S. She's a kind of young, fresh face, and her message apparently appealed to the significant share of the voters in Hsinchu. She faced off against Shen Huihong, who was a DPP deputy mayor in Hsinchu, but who also, like Chen Shizhong, had never run an election campaign before. And so she was, while well known in Hsinchu, was not tested in an election campaign before. One of the other interesting things about this race is that Lin Gengren, the KMT candidate, really struggled, and it appears that there was a lot of strategic voting where voters who would have favored the KMT abandoned Lin to vote for Gao to deny Shen the victory. And so there's my big takeaway from Hsinchu is that there's a lot of swing voters, a lot of voters who are willing, at least at the local level, to consider candidates rather than party, and are willing to kind of move between the different camps depending on who the candidate is.
Hey, Garris?
Yeah.
Did you have some other slides? Because we're stuck on the title slide here.
Are you really?
Yeah, I don't know. Are you able to move? Were you able to move it forward?
Let's see.
There we go. Okay. So that's Gao Hong'an, right?
Yeah, my apologies.
Does she go? Anne is her English name?
Yeah, Anne is her English
okay.
name.
And she won, I think, for the TPP, and
let's see.
That did go. You did go to the other one. There we
go. It did go? Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and then can you see this picture of Tsai resigning? No.
No. Now, yes. Okay. Now I see Tsai resigning.
Now you see it. You know what? Well, weird. Give me 1 second here. I think I know what's going on.
Okay.
Let's see. No, it's there. Weird.
I think if you go to slideshow, yeah, there you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, it's
So
moving now.
thank you.
Okay, yeah, so, God, so, so you guys haven't seen any of this. Okay, well, Taipei Mayor Jiang Wan'an, the Taoyuan Mayor-elect Zhang Shanzheng, and the Hsinchu Mayor-elect Gao Hong'an. There they all are. The big outcome here for the DPP was Tsai Ing-wen as the chairwoman handpicked a lot of the candidates who ran in the local elections, and they fared quite poorly overall. And so Tsai, very quickly after the election results were known, resigned as party chair. I'd note the same thing happened in 2018 after the DPP's defeat there. Tsai resigned. She actually had faced a primary challenge then, but was able to fend that off, be renominated as the presidential candidate, and then win in 2020. This time around, she's going to be term limited out of office, and so she's lost considerable influence over the DPP now, and is likely in, I hesitate to use the term lame duck, but her influence over the party nomination and over what the DPP does over the next 14 to she's got about 14 months left before the 2024 election, what they do. So there's some major changes within the DPP afoot now. The last thing I'll mention just briefly is that there was also a constitutional amendment on the ballots to lower the voting age. Taiwan's voting age is unusual among, from a comparative perspective, it's at 20 rather than 18. So this proposal was to lower the voting age to 18 to bring it into alignment with kind of international practice. That amendment received a slight majority of yes votes, but it was far below the threshold of 50% of all eligible voters that it needed to pass. And so this amendment failed, and failed with, I mean, it fell way short of the threshold that it needed to hit. So the voting age is still at 20 and will be for the foreseeable future. Just to give you some comparative context, and then I'll wrap up here. In the local elections, the DPP has generally struggled relative to the KMT. The DPP has generally done better in presidential and legislative races in the recent years. The one exception to that was in 2014, where there was a big green wave against the Ma administration. But in both 2018 and 2022, the DPP's party vote share has been significantly below the KMT's. If we look at the presidential elections over the last several cycles, DPP just smashed the KMT in 2016 and 2020. And so the takeaway I would encourage the audience to have from this is the KMT win here in 2022 does not indicate necessarily that they're going to clean up in 2024. We've already been through this cycle once before, where the KMT's victory in 2018 made a lot of people expect that they would win in 2020. That definitively did not happen. And so I do think we're going into a period where there's a lot that could change in the run up to 2024. And this is going to be a pretty volatile electoral cycle. But I still think the DPP probably should be favored in 2024. Briefly, the city and council city races, city and county council seat races. Interestingly, the KMT did really well in the mayor races. They actually lost some seats in the city council races, and the DPP gained seats relative to 2018. And so what this suggests to me is that the KMT had good candidates for the mayor's races, but its kind of generic partisan strength there's some weakness here relative to its overall kind of performance at the mayor's race level. And so the trends here are a little bit mixed if you really dig down into the numbers. Last thing I'll say about the council races, there are a bunch of small parties that ran in these. By far the best performing was the new Taiwan People's Party. They won 14 council races around the islands. Last cycle, the big winner among the small parties was the New Power Party. They won 16. They're now down to 6. They've really struggled over the last couple of years, and this is another kind of data point to suggest they're in some decline. And the other minor parties won a seat here and there, but generally this is still a two-party duopoly: KMT, DPP, and then a lot of independents at the local level as well. I just want to throw out some hypotheses about why the KMT did so well in this election, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues here. First, I just note the DPP president, Tsai Ing-wen, is actually fairly popular. She's polling above, she's above water. Her approval rate is above 50%. And generally this is a good sign. This is a good kind of fundamental if you are the ruling party going into these races. And so voters, I think, were able to compartmentalize between their approval of Tsai Ing-wen and their evaluation of candidates at the local races. And so this was, yeah, this picture looks quite a bit different from 2018, where Tsai Ing-wen was polling, her negatives were quite high. And you can much more easily interpret the 2018 results as a rejection of Tsai and the DPP. Here, she's still, again, above 50%. And so something else is going on here. I just note the KMT's share of partisans is now near a record low. This is from the Shenyang Zhongxin, so the Electoral Studies Center data that they've collected for the last 25 years. KMT is now only has about 15% of the electorate who identifies with them. The DPP is at more than twice that now. And so while the KMT did well in these elections, there's some kind of flashing warning signs for them in the partisan polling here. The rise in Taiwan identity has continued, and so the DPP has generally benefited from a rise in exclusivist Taiwan identity. So even though they lost here, I think the fundamentals still favor the DPP over the long run. And then if we look over the last couple of years, this question about independence versus unification, there's a big jump in support for independence over the last couple of years as well. And so all of these things point to kind of long-term trends that should favor the DPP. And so this local election cycle, I suspect is more of an aberration than a kind of fundamental swing back towards the KMT. Last thing, I'll just throw these out here, some ideas about why the KMT might have actually done well in this election. One is that the cities and counties overall are bluer than the national average. So there's a lot of cities and counties that have a pretty blue electorate, and then a couple that are deep green. And so if you just count the number of mayors, the KMT is going to be favored under that kind of framing of the election outcome. Second, the KMT had a lot of incumbents running in this election, particularly in New Taipei, in Taichung City, and in several counties in the south that typically vote for the DPP at the national level. The incumbency advantage in Taiwan is generally large. Voters tend to like their mayors regardless of whatever political party they're from. And so in this case, those popular incumbents really carried the KMT in a lot of places where they may have struggled otherwise. And then the third factor I think that's relevant here is the Tsai government's been in power over 6 years. There's kind of just a secular fatigue with the ruling party. We know this from the U.S. Voters kind of tune out, or their base gets frustrated because of all the compromises the ruling party has to make, and so they don't turn out at the same rates that they did in previous elections. The opposition is energized. They can just make a claim that they're not the ruling party, and that's often enough. And so as a result, you get a swing towards the opposition just as a kind of result of fatigue with the ruling party. So I think that's part of what's been going on here. That's That's all I have here. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues and look forward to hearing, I look forward to a robust conversation about these results.
All right, thanks so much, Garrison. Sorry about the slides there.
Yeah, my bad.
No, it's okay. Hopefully we can move those. We can revisit some of those during the Q&A.
Yeah.
So let's now pivot to you, Christina. You're gonna talk us through the role of economic issues in the election and you know, how that factored in. We know that's always a significant factor in the local elections there.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's certainly my pleasure to share some of my observation on Taiwan's economic and trade policy and the China factors in a local election and national election as well. So in my presentation today, I will first address DPP's economic and social policy over the last few years. And then I will indicate that the China threat narrative did not really play a major part in this election. And finally, I will discuss how this China carrot and stick strategy might shape the outcomes of the 2024 presidential elections. So for me, the DPP defeat at the 2022 election this year shows that people are not satisfied with the DPP performance on local issue. At the same time, I think it's also a sign of the maturity of the Taiwan's democracy because voters are able to compartmentalize their thinking about locals and national election. I think voters here in Taiwan care mostly about economic issue and their livelihoods. And the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly dealt a heavy blow to the service and manufacturing sectors in which a large numbers of people are employed here. And for example, in a survey conducted in September 2022, when Taiwanese people are asked about the issues they're most concerned about, it was economy. And economy was among the top concern at around 52%. But when asked about what specifically about the economy, the top two concern was about high housing prices, with the 74% of the Taiwanese people are really concerned about this issue. And then the rising living costs in Taiwan come after as the second most concerned issue. So over the last few decades, Taiwan's housing price grew one of the fattest rates in the world. And Taiwanese people also end up paying more, one of the highest housing prices and mortgage burdens globally. And due to the rising consumer prices, and Taiwan's real wage have fallen this year. And Taiwan's minimum wage is also one of the lowest in the advanced country in the world. And it also grew really slow over the last few decades. So while the President Tsai has decided to raise the minimum wage faster than her predecessor, but there's a more urgent task is to transform the economy in a way that did not only benefit the business and semiconductor, but also the workers in the manufacturing and service industry. So while Taiwanese workers are suffering, the DPP governments may promise to build more social housing, but still Taiwanese government has to at least social housing among the advanced country. So therefore, when the Taiwanese workers are facing really a hardship and the government is not really responding to their demands, the DPP cannot really effectively convince the general voter when President Tsai asked them to vote for DPP, and also using China to hold the voter as a kind of hostage during a local election. So it looks like the Taiwanese voters are really smart enough and not to allow DPP to hold them hostage with both the presidential and local election. So even if I think China is a real threat, the DPP has shown that it has offered nothing else to voters other than their constant threat of China. Therefore, the DPP really need to rethink what kind of vision they can offer to Taiwanese people at local levels. right? China threat narrative can really work for a while, but after some time, the narrative might lose its charm in local election. And the DPP has been in office for quite a long time. And I think like voters in Taiwan are really expecting to see the Tsai administration to implement the economic and social reforms. So that means that if the DPP is really concerned about, the welfare or the autonomy of Taiwan, then it really has to move beyond the kind of deep grim issue and to really understand that improving the livelihood and the wage of the Taiwanese people and workers in service and manufacturing industry in a more significant way. And that will also help to ensure a more sustainable protection of Taiwan's autonomy and independence, right? So in that sense, I think China threat factor really did not really play a major part in this election. In my view, this election is not really about China. It's about the failure of DPP's agenda setting that really leads to the low voter turnout for DPP, right? If it is really about China's economic coercion or China factor, then we will see a lot of sanction targeted at Taiwan's agriculture, produce, or manufacturing industry, or the southern part of Taiwan is the agricultural hub, then we might expect the South to swing hardest against the DPP. But this is not the case here this time, right? Southern Taiwan is DPP's stronghold in the local election. So the DPP's defeat is really not about China, but about DPP's own failure to set up a really positive agenda for party unity and also for Taiwan's economic future, right? So I think the local issue is the main point. So that's why I think this election, the right implication for this 2024 presidential election will be limited, right? So let me kind of wrap up briefly for my observation for the election this time. A local election in Taiwan are primarily focused on a personality and local issue, but it's not really about China or China threat. So in my view, the outcome of this election it may not be a good indicator of the January 2024 presidential election. So in terms of the Taiwan's party competition, right? While this election had local focus, it shows that the KMT has not really been eliminated as a competitive player. And I think it should not be really count out for 2024 presidential election. But however, I think if the KMT wants to be competitive, then you really needs to continue to work on its narrative and how to overcome its perception as the pro-Beijing or Beijing-leaning party in public perception. Specifically, I think the KMT really need to adjust its message or platform to align with the mainstream Taiwanese preference for the status quo. So overall, I think this Taiwan midterm election result could be a good thing if the DPP can really rethink about how it can craft a positive domestic reform agenda. And if the KMT can really get really serious about how to refine its China policy, that will be, generally preferable to the Taiwanese voter. And lastly, I will talk about China's carrot and stick approach to Taiwan and how this strategy might affect this Taiwan presidential election in 2024. Right. So as we all know, Taiwan really enjoy a high degree of freedom, trade freedom, speech of freedom, and its economy is heavily reliant on its export economy. Right. So Taiwan is one of the world's most important exporter of electronics and IT technology, and tariff rates or industrial products are comparable to those in industrial nations such as Japan and the United States. And most of the time, Taiwan generally follow the WTO rule. So as for the export and import data, 40% of Taiwan's export and more than 60% of its outbound investment were to the Chinese nation, or including Hong Kong over the last few decades. So that results in a high trade dependency on China. And that also gets some of the worry and speculations about how Taiwan can move beyond that recent year. So since September 2016, Taiwan has been following a new southbound policy to diversify its trade partnership by deepening its regional integration and increasing economic and trade and tourist links within its neighborhood country, including ASEAN nation, but also Australia and New Zealand, and making this island less dependent on trade with China. So it is in December 2020, Taiwan also began informal consultation, wanting to get a trade deal for Trans-Pacific Partnership, so-called CPTPP, in preparation for formally applying to join the trade partnership in the future. So let me say briefly about how would this China's economic leverage can cast on Taiwan's future, and also for the China-Taiwan relations. Briefly, in a few minutes. So Taiwan's economic dependence on China really points to its vulnerability to Beijing's sanctions against its target sector. Let me just briefly mention a few of examples. In the early 1990 to 2000, like Beijing warned that Taiwanese company would be barred from doing business in China if they favor independence or have strong tie to the DPP. So the Acer and Chimay Group have fallen victim to China's sanction, as they are being seen to promote Taiwan's independence or have the good ties with the Taiwanese president, right? And in 2011, China has signed a deal to purchase U.S. $4 million worth of milkfish from Tainan County. This is a traditionally pro-DPP district. Although this purchase has grew much media attention, it did not really turn into the substantive role for the pro-China candidate in the 2012 election. But so the main reason why such a strategic purchase did not turn into the electoral support was due to the limited numbers of the fish farmers that benefit from the deal. And I think more importantly, I think this China purchase or Taiwan's milkfish was not sustainable in nature, because it was only a one-time thing that failed to build a long-term, long-lasting relationship with the Taiwanese farmer. And China's attempt to win Taiwan's hearts and minds in the South via this kind of specific purchase agreement and preferential policy has been limited, because China has failed to garner this farmers' long-term support for the pro-China candidates in Taiwan's election. So in this sense, I think this could be the one thing that we could all look for looking toward the future presidential election, right? And China's growing economic claw has certainly raised much attention on Beijing's use of economic sanction, or also incentive for the pursuit of security goal or final unification, right? So I think this could be one thing that Taiwan and our allies in Asia, such as Australia and Canada, we can all look out for. I think the U.S. as well. We can all looking for a coherent way, right? A combined, coherent, effective way to respond to China coercion, so that we can deter its frequent use of economic sanctions to this target state more effectively. And this is my overall session of the role of economy in Taiwan's local and national elections. I'd like to thank you once again for John for inviting me to this great panels. I'm looking forward to this Q&A section. It was great meeting you all. I'm looking forward in more engaged in the exchange of ideas later on. Thank you.
Oops. Thank you, Christina. That was a really good overview, and yeah, of course, wouldn't and appreciate you touching on the economic coercion as well as the, I believe you said milkfish. So didn't see that as a factor in the election, but it's fascinating. All right, Russell, let's go to you to take a look at some of the broader dynamics of the election. If you're sitting in Beijing or Washington or Tokyo or Canberra, what do you make of what happened on Saturday?
Well, thanks a lot, John. It's really an honor for me to be able to participate in this discussion today, and kudos to you and Jamestown for hosting this very timely seminar. I'm very pleased to be able to be here on the virtual stage with Carlos and Christina. We're both given, really excellent and detailed presentations that I think lays out in great detail the results as well as the issues that permeated through the elections. And as your prompting of my presentation, it's primarily focused on really the sort of the broader national, regional, and potential regional and global implications of these local elections. But I do think it's important, to re-emphasize some of the, I think, the key points that feeds into what I think are, again, these implications for the national and otherwise global issues. And I like to make 3 points, basically. And the first point, in some ways, interprets the data that Carlos has already laid out in his excellent slides. And one is the first point is to try to, to push back against this narrative that I'm seeing in the media and commentators that this was, a historic defeat for the DPP or a blue wave for the KMT. I think while the 2020 elections were the lowest number of top political positions among the 22 cities, counties, and special municipalities that the DPP won in history. Now, if we look in terms of the net number of seats that the DPP lost, or the net number of the KMT won or lost, I think this will be a stronger indicator of any strength of a so-called wave. And this election, by those measures, are by far from the DPP's worst or the KMT's best, right? So I think to put matters into perspective, the KMT actually had a net loss of 1 seat, with its currently controlling 13, to the DPP's net loss of 2 seats, right, with 5 that it's currently controlling from what they had going into the elections. Now, in terms of net losses, the 2018 elections were far more devastating for the DPP and was by far the KMT's best performance in over, I think, 20 years. Now, for instance, in 2018, the KMT trounced the DPP by taking back control of 9 seats for the heads of these local governments by winning control of 15 of the top 15 of the 22 local offices, whereas the DPP lost a whopping 7 posts that it previously controlled by falling down to 6. So overall, I think in terms of the net change, right, the KMT's victory in these local elections could be really described as modest at best. Even if we assume that the KMT retains control or holds Jiayi City, which still has yet to hold its elections due to the death of one of the political candidates, and it will hold it in December. That will mean that the KMT will control 14 of the 22 seats, which is the same total number that it had going into the 2022 elections. So And then also, as I think Carl said already, had indicated in his presentations, the local elections tend to favor the KMT. Now, in the 8 local elections held in the past 20 years, not including this year's election, the DPP only won 3 sets of local elections in terms of popular votes received. That is a win rate for the KMT of 62% and a 37% win rate for the DPP. So, if one also considers, 2014 as an outlier due to the Sunflower Movement, the odds of the DPP winning at local elections are actually quite low. Now, that being said, I do want to point out that these were important symbolic victories for the KMT. So while the changes in the number of seats of the party do not reflect, I think, a significant change in the local electoral map, the seats that the KMT won and lost, as well as what the TPP did, compared to the DPP, do hold some important symbolic values that suggest certain political conditions may be playing out, and that could affect the more consequential 2022 presidential and legislative elections. And at the same time, the KMT's losses in the local elections, and yes, it did lose some, and they were arguably insignificant, right? This includes Hsinchu, Penghu, and Jingmen, as it now also controls 4 of the 6 special municipalities under the central government. So this is Taipei winning Taipei and winning Taoyuan, and then holding on to New Taipei and Taichung. So I'll get to why these matters when we talk about these implications for the national elections. The second point that I want to make is to caution people from drawing a straight line from, and as we've heard actually from both the previous speakers, drawing a straight line from the local elections to the presidential elections. Now, the local elections are often referred to by many observers as, and in the media, as a bellwether for the country's presidential and legislative elections. But the 22 results should not be automatically interpreted to mean that the KMT will win in the 2024 presidential and legislative elections. So to be clear, the predictive value of the local elections on which party will win the presidential election is actually quite low and marginal at best. Over the past 22 years, there were only 2 local elections where the party that won definitively in the local elections in terms of total votes received went on to win the presidential election. That was 2008 presidential election for the KMT and the 2016 presidential elections for the DPP. Excuse me. Now, the third point in getting to really the purpose of my presentation here today is its national and potentially regional and international impact. Now, as you've heard already from Christina, these local elections tend to focus on local issues, and frankly, also in my view, has really direct impact on regional and international issues. Now, where it does potentially impact the region or international issues is how it impacts the national elections in Taiwan. And as I've already noted, there is very little predictive value in terms of these local elections on who will win the presidential election. The significant impact of these elections are for how it shapes the internal dynamics of the political parties and party politics between them heading into the 2024 presidential election. First, the most significant impact will be how it impacts party dynamics within the KMT. It should be noted that there were calls early on from within the KMT for the chairman, Eric Zhu, to win a total of 16 seats. People like Zhang Yazong, who is the intellectual leader of the unification faction of the KMT, has called on the KMT chairman to step down if he did not meet this goal. And so even though Chairman Chu did not win a net of 2 additional seats, as noted earlier, the KMT chairman did win important seats. So whether this technicality will satisfy his detractors within the party remains to be seen. The point here is that the KMT chairman cannot rest peacefully. Chu's modest performance overall, but with these critical wins, are not going to be a game changer for the 2024 elections. Now, recall the significant electoral victory in 2018 for the KMT in the local elections. Then Chairman Wu Denyi probably expected to become the presidential candidate, but was sidelined through a special process within the party that was pushed through within, hardliners within the party that ended up drafting Han Kuo-yu. And so, as noted previously, despite this electoral victory in 2018, the DPP won the presidential election in 2020, and as well as maintaining its majority in the legislative election that year as well. Now, I think KMT's leaders, allied with the current chairman, will really want to spin the results of this election as positively as possible to ensure that the chairman remains the leader. I think at the very least, the chairman should be able to convince the party to give him more time to build on the momentum from the local elections and hopefully coalesce greater support around his leadership, and thereby giving the party arguably a more competitive chance in the 2024 presidential and legislative elections. Yet, there are still going to be a lot of variables that will be at play. It will be party unity, his own popularity ratings, and perhaps more notably in this upcoming election, third-party candidates like TPP Chairman Ko Wen-je. Now, the second, other implications of the local elections for the national elections relates to the resignation of Tsai Ing-wen as chair of the DPP. Now, as noted previously, it is customary for the chairman of the losing party to step down to take responsibility for the party's losses or poor performance. But given, I think, the trend lines and the odds of winning, it was not really a surprise that the DPP was going to lose in these elections and that President Tsai would step down as the chairman of the party. But also, as Carl's noted, her resignation from the post will weaken her control of the DPP during the party's upcoming primary process, which is set to begin in the first quarter of 2023. This is probably going on as we speak right now. Now, this could inject unknown variables into that contest. I think while Vice President Lai Ching-te appears to be the likely front runner still to become the DPP's presidential candidate, the absence of Tsai to manage the factional competition within the DPP makes the process a bit more unpredictable. So, but that being said, I think supporters of the vice president that have been elected into the DPP Central Committee will likely militate against any of these greater uncertainties in that process. Another related party politics point observation is that the TPP remains a viable third party. It controls 5 seats in the legislative yuan and was able to retain at least 1 seat in the local offices, despite losing, Taipei City because Ko Wen-je wasn't running. And certainly it would have liked to win some of these other local races to build this local organization. But local elections are challenging for third parties regardless, given their limited resources. Now, there is no doubt that, Ko Wen-je has ambition for higher offices and is gaming out his options for the 2024 presidential and legislative elections. I think he will be a wild card in the 2024 presidential race. While speculative, the KMT's tight victory may convince him that he has a better chance than previously expected. And at the same time, it could very well position itself to team up with the KMT or even the DPP in the 2024 presidential and legislative elections, making its role potentially even more valuable. A third observation that I want to make is that a factor that worked in the favor of the KMT in the local elections, as noted by Christina, was the inability of the DPP to turn cross-strait elections into an electoral issues in these local elections. This is despite the efforts of President Tsai herself, as well as the DPP, to make it so, which was perhaps, in my view, too little too late. Despite events including the Chinese military's massive exercises in August and its imposition of import restrictions from Taiwan following that, as well as the KMT vice chairman's visit to China during these military exercises, it was surprising to me, at least as an observer, that there was not a more noticeable impact on voter preferences in these elections. But I think, as Christina has really artfully explained, again, these elections tend to focus on local issues and personalities, and not about these national issues like cross-strait relations. And so how these cross-strait issues will impact the national elections in 2024 will likely be quite different. So again, we have to be, I think, more mindful about the impact that we can read into these local elections for 2024. I think in conclusion, briefly, the local elections have little direct impact on cross-strait relations, and as a result, have limited regional as well as global implications. But indirectly, as I've outlined, in terms of how it influences, internal party politics and dynamics there, it does have implications for the 2024 presidential election, and especially the primary process that will be ongoing, beginning in 2023. And so even though it was not a blue wave, as some have described, the KMT is certainly the party heading into the election, the 2024 election, with their stronger momentum. So with that, we'll turn it back to you, John.
All right, thank you, Russell. And thanks as well to Karis and Christina. Really good overviews there. I want to turn it over to the audience for question and answer now. You can raise your virtual hand or type a question. I guess really quickly, as questions start to come in, let me ask, we talked about cross-strait relations not being a major factor in the elections, or really much of a factor at all. Do you think that was aided at all by some of the shift in the KMT, some of the effort by Eric Chu to position the party and to overhaul the party's image to make it seem less of a pro-China party and more of a quote unquote, pro-status quo party? So obviously, the KMT hasn't abandoned the 1992 consensus, but it does feel like, since Han's defeat in 2020, both Johnny Chung and now Eric Chu have tried to shift the party. So I wonder if that had an impact at all in kind of minimizing the role of cross-strait relations. Christina, let's go to you, I guess, because you're there. So I want you take that one. Sorry to give you maybe a tough one off the bat there. So.
No, thank you, John, for this excellent question. I think this, there could be a win or victory for KMT, as it has secured some of the important seats for municipal election in Taiwan. But I think in looking toward the future for the national presidential election, for all this presidential candidate, whether it's in DPP or KMT, has to address Taiwan's future, economic future, or how to address Taiwan's security environments in Asia Pacific, right? As I mentioned previously in my talk about Taiwan's vulnerability or trade dependence on China. I think Taiwan's problem in tourism or agriculture or manufacturing industry cannot be really easily solved in the short term. So therefore, DPP or KMT president has to conduct a strategic, a structural shift to a higher value chain and service industry, in the long run. So diversifying Taiwan's economy and identifying alternative investment option is the most important thing for the president candidate or a future president in Taiwan, and for business sectors. That's the most important thing that we all should be post most attention on. And so that's why, in that sense, I think, DPP's, President Tsai has really done a good job, because he has implement the new sound policy and really propose a people-centric initiative to foster greater culture and social exchange with the Southeast Asian country. It served as a part of Taiwan's grand strategy to hedge against China's economic coercion and build alternative option for Taiwan. So in that sense, I think looking to the future, DPP or KMT presidential candidate or even future president has really need to, carry on this important, Taiwanese economic trade policy to deepen this culture, economic and trade linkage with Southeast Asian country, or even can be extended to country in India, Australia, and New Zealand, so that you can situate Taiwan embedded Taiwan in a regional trade network or even security architecture with United States or US allies in East Asia.
All right, Russell or Karis, any comments on the KMT's relative, I guess, makeover, and whether that had any impact on cross-strait relations not being a big factor at all?
I would just say that, I think the KMT leadership has tried very hard in this election to not make cross-strait relations the issue of the local elections. And I think it comes from a clear understanding that, local elections should be focused on local issues, and that cross-strait relations would, given its sensitivity, could hurt its chances more than help it. And so, despite, I think, as you saw early on in August, when the KMT vice chairman traveled to China and to meet with compatriots there, as well as some officials, the KMT leadership, really went out of their way to quell some concerns that were expressed even within the party about whether this was a wise move. And, really the heavyweights of the party came publicly to support the vice chairman's visit and to also and downplay the significance of this visit. And I think that was a very calculated decision on his part to really downplay cross-strait relations, and then try to emphasize again the centrist credentials of the candidates that they fielded in these elections, to focus on the personalities, individuals, and less about sort of national policy issues. And I think they were relatively successful in that regard.
I don't need to say much on this. I agree with my fellow panelists here, but I do think the KMT had the right chairman for this election. It mattered, I think, less what Ju said and more of who he was. So he's not from the kind of the deep blue fundamentalist wing of the KMT. He's also somebody who's had a lot of experience in local government. He was a two-time county executive of Taoyuan, and then was two-time mayor of New Taipei. And so I think he was well positioned to lead the party and kind of reshape its image in a more pragmatic direction. If Zhang Yazhong, the deep blue candidate who ran against him for party chair, or someone even more kind of controversial like Hong Xiuju, if they had been the chair instead, I think that would have really dragged the KMT's chances down quite a bit in this election. So in one sense, the KMT was playing with house money here. They already, they had a kind of built-in advantage in this election. They just had to not screw it up. And I think Ju didn't screw it up. He did well enough to allow the kind of strength of local candidates to shine through, rather than having cross-strait issues and the 1992 consensus and the kind of intra-party fighting about what their position on dealing with Beijing should be. So I think that, yeah. So I think Jude deserves some credit here for this victory.
Great. I wonder myself, and this is kind of a not a non sequitur, but I wonder how much the KMT has maybe learned from watching the TPP and Ko's success, and maybe in not playing up cross-strait issues. All right, so let's pivot now. Let's zoom out a little bit. We have a question from Tina Chung from the Voice of America China. And Tina asks, she's asking about the 2024 election and the US factor. How will that impact the DPP and KMT candidates in terms of their policy, their approach to China and cross-strait relations? And then she mentioned kind of the famous or maybe infamous field trip to Washington, I guess, by presidential candidates. Although I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Han Kuo-yu did not come to Washington. I think he only went to the West Coast and Boston, I believe. So, Karis. Oh.
He came to Stanford too. We hosted him in April 2019. So he made a swing through the US, but he did not go to DC. You're correct.
Pointedly did not go to DC. So maybe that's part of the question. Would we see the potential KMT candidate, whether it's Ho Yo-yi or maybe Mr. Jiang, right? I guess he just won the Taipei mayorship. Would they make the field trip to Washington, and how would Washington factor in? And then same thing, with a potential DPP candidate, whether it's Lai Ching-te or someone else. How does that factor in? I guess, Russell, why don't we go to you, because you're in Washington. So.
Thank you for that question, John, and nice to hear from you, Tina, as always. So I think the United States will always be a factor in Taiwan's presidential election, whether it wants to be or not. And I think 2024 will be no different in this regard. Some may recall in 2012, when President candidate Tsai ran first for the presidential election. She had a very controversial visit to the United States, and some believe that the reaction by the United States to her positions then had costed the DPP the presidential election in 2012. But come 2016, the President Tsai, had a very, I think, successful visit, and following that, has demonstrated, built up a lot of trust with the U.S. side that I think should ameliorate some concerns. But that being said, obviously, President Tsai is not the candidate for the 2024 election. And so it will depend on who the candidate will be on the DPP side. And given the importance of U.S. Taiwan relations for Taiwan's national security, foreign policy, and cross-strait relations, I think we can expect that the candidate or a trusted interlocutor will have to make a visit to communicate the policies and positions of these candidates, and likewise for the KMT. That's it.
Okay, Christina or Karis, anything to add on the U.S. factor looking ahead to 2024?
Yeah. So I can just reiterate a couple things that Russell hit on. One, actually, a separate point, but none of the potential front runners in 2024 are well known to officials in the U.S. And so Tsai Ing-wen in 2012 and 2016, I think, was already pretty well understood by the U.S. There was, and then on the KMT side, Eric Ju is well known in the U.S. If he is a candidate in 2024, that would maybe a trip isn't necessary because there's been a lot of conversation with him. But on the DPP side, William Lai, I don't think is well known or understood in the U.S. If there are other DPP candidates out there, Chen Jianren's name has been floated. He's the former vice president. Zheng Wen-san, the current mayor of Taoyuan, has been floated as a potential alternative presidential candidate. Neither of them are household names in the U.S., even among people who follow Taiwan politics closely. And so both of them, I think, would have a lot to gain if they were to come to the U.S. and have these conversations. And then on the KMT side, I actually think Hou Youyi is probably the strongest candidate they could run. He's the current mayor of New Taipei. And so if he were to run, he would benefit, I think, a lot from, and certainly the U.S. side would benefit a lot from him coming to visit and for American officials to get to know him a little better. And then, there's likely to be a third party candidate. Ko Wen-je, I think, is more likely than not to run in this race. I'd note he was, I think, very smart strategically in creating the TPP 4 years ago, and they won 5 seats in the legislature. So that allows him, he's got a presidential ballot line that he can run on. He doesn't have to go around and collect signatures now. And so there's an institutional reason for him to run as well. It's an easier thing for him to do. So I would be actually kind of surprised if he doesn't run. And he is, since he's been mayor of Taipei, he's more prominent than a lot of the other candidates, potential candidates. But I think, if he wanted to make a visit to the U.S., I think that would be beneficial to both sides as well. So we're in a cycle where there's an open seat contest. There's no incumbent running. There's no clear front runner in either. There's no clear front runner to win the next election, and so. I think both Taiwan and the U.S. would benefit a lot from these visits. And so I hope they happen.
Yeah, so I think the panelists had already highlighted a possible candidate for DPP and KMT or the third party possible for the presidential election. So I just want to add on, regardless of, the final presidents will be for the 2024 elections result. I would say that, if those candidates will want to make a successful trip or being interviewed, by the United States or, higher official among the White House, I think they have to take into account, align themselves into the kind of reality of increasing great power competition between the United States and China, right? So as China become more assertive in its sovereignty claim over Taiwan, they have to, kind of acknowledge or realize that it's not really about Taiwan, but China that has taken this assertive stance and wanted to change the status quo in the cross-strait relations. Right. So certainly, China has become a more powerful in terms of economic scale, and it's more frequent use of economic coercion. So that this allure of China's economic benefits come at a significant cost, as Beijing hopes to negotiate Taiwan's political status or legal status in the near future. So that's why I think, President Tsai, in this sense, has generally refrained from provoking Beijing over this independent issue, even though that Beijing has always thought that President Tsai wanted to, being a provocative or want to go a step forward to, de jure independent. But that's not how the U.S. Assess or think of what President Tsai is doing in Taiwan. So I think rather it's an increasing stronger China that aims at pushing for unification, while Taiwan, under the President Tsai Ing-wen's administration, remains moderate and restrained most of the time. So looking into the future, I think this kind of dynamic still apply for the future candidate. If they wanted to go to the trip to the United States, those candidates really need to, present themselves as a status quo, a political leader for Taiwan, and remain moderate and restrained most of the time, while trying to secure the autonomy for the Taiwan, for the welfare being for the Taiwanese people.
Great, thank you. There's so much to think about here, and I think we could carry on this discussion for much longer. Actually, I think from the perspective of a U.S. Taiwan watcher and thinking about future candidates, the two people that I have the most questions about and would be most interested to hear from would be Mayor Ko, if he ends up running. I think the TPP has been much less forthcoming about their approach to cross-state relations than the KMT, I think. And then I would be interested, if there is another a deep blue KMT candidate, I think it would also be worth talking, but I don't know if those discussions would happen in Washington or in Stanford or elsewhere. So a lot to think about. I guess any final words from the panelists? I spoke at the beginning about the protests in China, and one thing that was kind of filtering through my head is I wondered if the protests had happened a week earlier, what impact would it have on the Taiwan elections, if any at all, right? We heard KMTs mention the idea of free China or 自由中国, right? Does that, sounded really far-fetched 7 or 8 months ago, right? I think it's, still out there, right? But does it change things, right? So I guess any last words kind of tying it into the current events. Let me go to you, Garis, because I know it's early there, and yeah.
Sure. I guess so. My big takeaway from this local elections was just how little all of the kind of outside shocks, how little of a difference they made to the final outcome. I did kind of a deep dive on the state of the election in August, and just kind of came up with a ranking of how I thought the various races would go. And really almost nothing changed from August until November. And remarkably, in there, you had Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. You had the subsequent military exercises and threats from the PRC. You had the U.S. midterms. You had the 20th Party Congress in the PRC. So you had a bunch of different events that could have really created a shock. You had very volatile energy prices because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing war there. There's just lots of stuff that could have affected this race. And in fact, it was really stable. And so I'm a little skeptical that anything that would take place in the PRC it would have to be something massive to kind of break through the just secular trend here in Taiwan local elections. And so even if these protests had happened a week before, I think my prior is that they wouldn't have made much difference.
Okay, great. Because I was kicking myself, said, should I, about the scheduling of the event, but I think that maybe I'm taking too much of a PRC centric approach. I guess Russell or Christina, any final takeaways from there? We've had it hammered into our head. I think it's a great point to go out on, right? Is the elections really taking place in a local context, and there's not much that can really kind of break through that. I think that's I had that feeling coming in, but it's even stronger leaving the event. As we wrap up here.
Yeah, I just, I think Christina made an excellent observation when she characterized the ability of Taiwanese voters to compartmentalize, the local elections from the national elections. And I think that's a very accurate description of what we saw in terms of the issues and the results of these elections. And so I think, like Carlos said, barring a very massive, event in the PRC or actions, taken by the PRC, it would have, at least I think, reflected in even the results that we saw in this election, very little impact in terms of the results. So.
Yes, I just want to say one more thing about possible China factors in future local or national elections. I think as China's capability increase, right, its use of coercive measure in both growing in frequency and evolve in scope in future, right? For example, China has implemented different coercive measures, including export quota, import restriction, tourist ban, and safety inspection against many countries in the world. For example, Japan, Philippines, and South Korea, and Norway have all fallen victim to China's economic sanction. So in that sense, economic, dependency with China has presented kind of risk or also opportunity to any country's national interest. So in this sense, I think Taiwan is really at the forefront of China's economic and military coercion, as Beijing will now really renounce the use of force to deter Taiwan's autonomy or security interests. But at the same time, the private business sectors in Taiwan, they're also heavily dependent on the bilateral trade, have a strong interest in maintaining the stable China-Taiwan relation. So I think looking into the future, Chinese government might try to, use both economic coercion or economic incentive, trying to, get into exert its influence, maybe in local or national influence, trying to shape the future outcome or policy option for the Taiwanese government. I think that's the things that all the policymakers in Taiwan and also scholars in Chinese foreign policy in China-Taiwan relation has to really look out for China use of economic coercion or selective incentive that might really shape Taiwan's policy option in the future.
John, if I may, just a two fingers on
Yes,
this
yes.
final point, it just occurred to me that I think it's an important point to make is really that I hope Beijing does not draw the wrong lessons from these local elections results. And I'm certain that there's probably some advisors in Beijing telling Xi Jinping that the August exercises deterred the independence forces, and that is why the KMT won the local elections. And I think, as you've heard very clearly from Carlos, Christina, and myself here today's discussion, that's certainly not the case. But I think time and again, Beijing has proven incapable of adjusting to the objective realities in Taiwan. And I think despite I think the reasons for why the results were as they were, Beijing may not be able to prevent itself from interfering in Taiwan's upcoming presidential and legislative elections. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, I think that's something we can certainly guarantee, right? A mix of heavy interference, economic coercion. So Christina, I thank you for that point, and then also Russell as well. I think that's a key point. Encouraging Beijing not to draw the wrong lessons, although I'm sure we'll have to see what's said about Taiwan, heading into next year and at the two sessions. But I am certain it will remain central to the pursuit of national rejuvenation. All right. Well, on that, thank you to our panelists for being so generous with their time today. So much to think about here, so many key implications, and you'll be able to watch the whole recording of the discussion either on our website, jamestown.org, or on our YouTube page. You can revisit it to check out any of these great insights. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evening or day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks, Karis
Yeah.
and Russell. Really appreciate it.
John.